For 43 years, I believed the word family meant the same thing to everyone in my house that it meant to me. I was wrong. My name is Irene, and I am 67 years old. I live in a two-bedroom house on the edge of Maryville, Tennessee, the same house where my late husband Gerald and I raised our two children, where we painted the kitchen 3 different shades of yellow before we found the one that felt right, where we buried 2 dogs in the backyard under the old oak tree. We were not wealthy people. Gerald worked 28 years for the county road department. I taught 4th grade at Maryville Elementary until my knees gave out. We had a pension, a paid-off mortgage, and a savings account we never touched, because Gerald always said, "That money is for when we really need it, Irene. We haven't needed it yet." We never thought our daughter's husband would be the reason we finally needed it. I should tell you about my daughter first, because you need to understand how much I loved her before I tell you what happened. Melissa was born in the middle of a February ice storm. The roads were so bad that Gerald nearly drove into a ditch getting me to the hospital, and I remember gripping the door handle and thinking, this child is already making her presence known. She came into the world loud and stubborn and completely certain that she deserved everyone's full attention. I adored her for exactly those reasons. She was bright. That was the word her teachers always used, bright, like she was a lamp someone had switched on. She finished high school with honors, got a partial scholarship to University of Tennessee, and studied business administration. Gerald and I drove to Knoxville for every parents' weekend, which it photographs at every graduation. We were so proud we could barely speak. The summer after she graduated, she came home for a weekend and brought a man with her. His name was Troy. He was tall, with dark hair swept back from his forehead, and a firm handshake and a way of looking directly at you when he talked that felt, at the time, like respect. He was working in commercial real estate in Nashville, he told us. He'd grown up in Clarksville, parents still there, church-going family, all the things you want to hear. He was 31, Melissa was 24. I had a feeling I couldn't name that first weekend. Not dislike exactly. More like the sensation you get when a piece of furniture is slightly off-center. Nothing is broken, nothing is wrong, but something keeps pulling your eye. Gerald liked him. Gerald was a better person than me in many ways, more willing to give people the benefit of the doubt. And he said that night after Troy and Melissa had gone to bed, "He seems solid, Irene. He seems like a man who takes things seriously." I told myself Gerald was right. I told myself the uneasy feeling was just a mother not wanting to let go. They married 18 months later at a little wedding venue outside of Franklin. I wore a dusty rose dress that Melissa had picked out for me. Gerald cried during the ceremony, which he would deny for the rest of his life. I cried too, but I told myself those were happy tears, and most of them were. The first 5 years were quiet. Troy and Melissa bought a house in Brentwood, which was more house than 2 people needed. But Troy said the neighborhood was an investment. He was always talking about investments. The market, equity, opportunity. He had a vocabulary for money that made everything sound inevitable and smart. Gerald and I drove up a few times a year for holidays. We brought casseroles. We fixed things that needed fixing. We tried not to notice that the house felt staged somehow, like a showroom, every surface clean and deliberate. Our grandson was born when Melissa was 29. They named him Cooper. He had Gerald's ears and Melissa's stubbornness, and I fell completely in love with him the moment I held him in that hospital corridor. I became a different version of myself after Cooper was born. Softer, more patient, more willing to overlook things I perhaps should not have overlooked, because I wanted to be in that child's life. And being in that child's life meant being in Troy's orbit. Gerald retired when he was 63. His pension was modest but reliable, about $2,400 a month, and we had the savings, which by then had grown to just under $119,000, sitting in a CD account at First Tennessee Bank. We also owned the house outright, valued at around $300,000 by then. We were not rich, but we were secure, which felt like the same thing after decades of careful living. Troy knew all of this. I'm not sure exactly when the conversations shifted, but I remember that around the time Gerald retired, Troy started being more interested in our finances. He would ask questions that seemed like questions about our well-being. Are you getting a good return on that CD? And have you thought about what happens to the house when you're gone? But which, looking back, were questions about numbers, about access. The first time he suggested we meet with his financial advisor, Gerald, and I talked about it for a week. I was against it. Gerald said it couldn't hurt to listen. We drove to Nashville and sat in a glass-walled office, and the advisor, a young man who looked barely old enough to shave, talked for 90 minutes about annuities and estate planning and tax advantage vehicles. He kept referring to Troy as someone who really has your best interests at heart. I noticed that the advisor had a small framed photo on his desk, and in it he was standing with Troy at what looked like a golf course. We didn't move any money that day, but the seed had been planted. Gerald's health started declining 2 years after he retired. Nothing dramatic at first. Fatigue, some shortness of breath, a stubbornness about seeing doctors that was pure Gerald. When he finally went in, they found blockage in 2 arteries. He had bypassed surgery in the fall, and the recovery was hard. He was home for 8 weeks, and I was his nurse, his cook, his chauffeur, and his entertainment, and I would have done every minute of it again without a second thought. But it changed things. We both felt it, the awareness that the time we had was not infinite, that the words "when we're gone" had stopped being hypothetical. Troy seemed to feel it too. He came to visit more during that period, which I told myself was kindness. He would sit with Gerald in the living room and they would talk. And sometimes when I passed the doorway, I would catch fragments: the house, the account, Melissa's security. I told myself it was a son-in-law looking out for his father-in-law's affairs. I told myself a lot of things. In the spring of the following year, Troy proposed that we add Melissa's name to the deed of the house. Just a formality, he said, just to simplify things down the road. Gerald agreed before I had a chance to say anything. I signed the papers at a notary's office in town, smiling at the woman across the desk, while something cold moved through my chest that I refused to examine. 3 months later, he suggested we move the savings into a joint investment account that he and Melissa would co-manage. For growth, he said, to make your money work harder while you still have time to enjoy it. Gerald said yes again. I said I needed to think about it. That was the first time Troy's face changed in front of me. Just for a moment, a flicker of something flat and impatient behind his eyes before his expression rearranged itself back into consideration and warmth. I saw it. I did not say anything, but I did not sign. I started paying closer attention after that. It wasn't easy to investigate your own family. I want you to understand that. Every time I pulled a bank statement from the file cabinet and sat down with it, I felt like a traitor. Every time I made a note of a date or an amount, I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was a suspicious old woman who didn't deserve the family she had. I almost stopped twice. Both times I thought about that flicker behind Troy's eyes, and I kept going. What I found over the following 6 months turned my stomach. Troy had been systematically draining a joint account that Gerald had opened for household expenses, an account Gerald had mentioned to me only once, in passing, as a convenience. Troy had been transferring funds from it in amounts just under the reporting threshold, $9,800 here, $9,800 there, moving the money into an LLC he had quietly formed in Delaware. The LLC's registered agent address was a mail forwarding service. The LLC's listed purpose was real estate consulting. It had, as far as I could find, no clients and no properties. By my rough count, he had moved approximately $67,000 out of that account over 22 months. I sat in my kitchen at 2 a.m. with the papers spread across Gerald's old table, and I was shaking so hard I had to put both hands flat on the surface to steady myself. Not from fear, or not only from fear, from grief, because I had to ask myself how much my daughter knew, and I could not answer that question. I still cannot answer it fully, even now. I called a lawyer the next morning, not a family friend, not anyone connected to Troy or Nashville. I drove 40 minutes to Knoxville and sat down with an attorney named, well, it doesn't matter what her name was. What matters is that she was a woman in her 50s who had seen everything, and when I laid the papers out in front of her, she did not look surprised. She looked tired. This is not the first time I've seen this pattern, she told me. It usually escalates. She advised me not to confront Troy directly. She advised me to get Gerald fully informed and to move any remaining accessible assets into accounts Troy had no knowledge of. She advised me to document everything and to say nothing. I drove home and told Gerald. That conversation broke something in my husband that I don't think ever fully healed. He sat at that same kitchen table and looked at the papers for a long time without speaking. Then he said very quietly, "I thought he was a good man." And I said, "I know you did." And there was nothing else to say. We did what the lawyer advised. We moved money. We changed beneficiary designations. We consulted with the county deed office about the house. We were careful and we were quiet. And we told no one, not our friends, not my sister in Asheville, not Gerald's brother, Walt. Not Gerald's brother, not anyone. The loneliness of that period was something I still don't have words for. We were protecting ourselves from our own daughter's husband, and we could not tell a soul. In October, Troy called and invited us for Thanksgiving. His voice on the phone was warm and normal and gave nothing away. I accepted. I don't know why. Maybe I needed to look at him and see if I could find the line between the man Gerald had called solid and the man who'd been moving our money into a Delaware shell company. Maybe I wanted to see Melissa's face. Thanksgiving was terrible in a way that no one in that house would have admitted. Everything looked perfect. The table was set beautifully. The food was catered from somewhere expensive. Cooper ran through the house in his socks and made Gerald laugh for the first time in weeks. Troy was charming and attentive, and twice he put his hand on my shoulder in a gesture that was supposed to feel like affection. After dinner, while Melissa was putting Cooper to bed, Troy sat down next to Gerald on the couch and started talking about the investment account again. The one I hadn't signed for. He had a new proposal, revised terms, a printed document he slid across the coffee table. He said it was for our benefit. He said Melissa worried about us. He said, and this is the part I still hear sometimes at night, "You've worked hard your whole life, Gerald. You deserve to stop worrying about money." Gerald looked at the document for a long moment. Then he looked at me. I shook my head. The look on Troy's face this time was not a flicker. It was several full seconds of naked anger before he got it back under control. He picked up the document, smiled, said no pressure, and went to help with the dishes. Gerald and I drove home that night, mostly in silence. Somewhere around Linmore City, Gerald said, "He's not going to stop, Irene." I said, "No." He said, "What do we do?" I said, "We already did it. Now we wait." We did not have to wait long. In early December, I received a call from a detective with the Knox County Sheriff's Office. A woman who had worked with Troy at his real estate firm had filed a complaint. She alleged that Troy had used client escrow funds for personal expenses, a pattern dating back several years, totaling somewhere north of $400,000. The detective was calling me because my name had appeared in related financial documents. He wanted to know if I was willing to speak with them. I said yes. I said yes without hesitating for one moment. What followed was 4 months that I can only describe as the simultaneous collapse and reconstruction of my understanding of my own life. Gerald and I cooperated fully with the investigation. Our attorney was present for every conversation. The records we had gathered, the bank statements, the transfer documents, the screenshots I had taken of the LLC registration, turned out to be more useful than I had known. The detective told me with genuine surprise in his voice that I had done better preliminary documentation than most professionals he worked with. Troy was arrested in March. The charges included wire fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and misappropriation of client funds. The Knox County DA's office added a separate charge related to the transfers from Gerald's account. The night we learned about the arrest, Gerald and I sat on our back porch. Even though it was cold, we could see the outline of the old oak tree in the dark, the one with our dogs buried beneath it. Gerald had a cup of coffee and I had a glass of wine, which I almost never drink, and we sat there for a long time without saying much. "What about Melissa?" he finally said. It was the question I had been circling for months. What I had found and what the investigation had determined was that Melissa knew something was not right with Troy's finances, but had chosen not to look closely. She had not participated in the fraud directly. She had not stolen from us with her own hands. But she had lived inside the comfortable life his deceptions funded, and she had not asked questions. And somewhere in that silence was a choice I did not know how to forgive yet. She called me 3 days after the arrest. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her. She said she was sorry. She said she had not known how deep it went. She said Troy had told her the money transfers were for our benefit, estate planning, that we had agreed. She said she had believed him. She said, and her voice broke completely when she said this, "Mom, I didn't know he was stealing from you. I swear to you, I didn't know." I believe parts of that. I still do. But belief is not the same as absolution, and absolution was not something I was in a position to offer her that day. Cooper spent spring break with us that year. He was 7 by then, old enough to know something had happened, but not old enough to understand what. He asked me once where his dad was, and I said his dad was dealing with some difficult things, and he looked at me with those serious brown eyes and said, "Is he in trouble?" I said, "Yes, baby, he is." Cooper thought about that for a while and then said, "Are you and Grandpa okay?" And I said, "Yes, we are." That was true. We were okay. We had been afraid and we had been lonely and we had been grieving a version of our family that turned out to have never quite existed. But we were standing in our own kitchen, in our own house, with our names on the deed, with our savings intact, and with the knowledge that we had not been foolish. We had been targeted by someone who was very good at what he did, and we had caught him. Troy was convicted in November of the following year. He received 8 years in federal prison and was ordered to pay restitution totaling $487,000, a number that included the funds taken from other clients, as well as the $67,000 taken from Gerald and me. We were not under any illusion that we would see most of that money, but the number existing on a court document meant something to me that I couldn't fully articulate. My relationship with Melissa is something I am still rebuilding, slowly, the way you rebuild anything that has been structurally damaged, carefully with attention to what is load-bearing and what is decorative. She is in therapy. She moved back to Maryville with Cooper, renting an apartment about 6 minutes from our house. We have dinner together on Sundays. Some Sundays are easier than others. Gerald's health stabilized. He turned 68 in July, and we took a 4-day trip to the Smoky Mountains that he had been talking about for 20 years. We stayed in a small cabin, and he went fishing every morning and came back with nothing, and was happy about it. I sat on the porch and read novels and drank coffee and watched the light move across the mountains, and for the first time in nearly 3 years, I did not feel like I was waiting for something to go wrong. I want to tell you something that I've thought about a great deal since all of this happened. There is a thing that happens to people when someone they love is in front of them, something in the brain that wants to resolve discomfort by finding the innocent explanation. I did it for years with Troy. I saw the signs, I felt the wrongness. And I kept finding reasons not to act on it, because acting on it meant accepting that my daughter had married someone capable of this, and that was a grief I was not ready to carry. What I would tell any woman in that position is this: the grief is survivable. The grief of seeing clearly is hard, but it is a grief that ends. The grief of not acting, of looking back and understanding that you watched something happen and chose not to intervene because you are afraid of what you would find, that grief has no bottom. I'm not angry at myself for the years I didn't see it. I was doing the best I could with what I knew, but I am grateful every single day that I finally sat down at that kitchen table with those bank statements and let myself see what was there, that I called the lawyer, that I told Gerald, that we did not wait to be completely certain before we moved to protect ourselves, because by the time you are completely certain, it is often already too late. Cooper came over last Saturday. He is 8 now, gap-toothed and loud, and obsessed with baseball in a way that reminds me so much of Gerald at that age, it sometimes makes my throat close. He sat at the kitchen table and ate 3 pieces of the apple cake I made, and then he looked up at me with frosting on his chin and said, "Grandma, can we plant something under the oak tree? Like flowers or something?" I looked out at the old tree in the backyard, at the roots, at the ground that had held everything we had buried there. "Yes," I said, "I think that's a very good idea." There is a version of that night I used to replay differently in my head, the version where I closed the file cabinet, went back to bed, and told myself I had imagined it. I almost lived that version. I almost chose the comfort of not knowing over the harder, colder truth sitting right there on Gerald's kitchen table. I think about what would have happened if I had. Troy would have gotten the signature he wanted. The house would have eventually changed hands. The savings we spent decades building, 2 people who packed their own lunches and drove cars until the wheels nearly fell off, would have disappeared into a Delaware LLC that existed only on paper, and we would have spent our final years confused about why we felt uneasy, never quite able to name the thing that had been done to us. What stopped me from closing that cabinet was not courage. Not at first. It was a small, stubborn refusal to lie to myself one more time. That is the thing nobody tells you about integrity. It does not always arrive as something grand. Sometimes it arrives as 2 in the morning and a stack of bank statements and a decision to keep reading when every tired, loving part of you wants to stop. I was not a suspicious woman by nature. I gave Troy years of good faith. I smiled at him across holiday tables. I told myself the unease I felt was my own failing, my own inability to let my daughter grow up and choose her own life. Looking back, I understand that this willingness to doubt myself before I doubted him was something he counted on. People who deceive families for a living understand one thing very well, that the people who love each other the most are the least willing to believe the worst of one another. That gap between love and clear sight is where they operate. Gerald used to say that a person's character is not what they do when someone is watching. It is what they do when they are absolutely certain no one will ever find out. Troy had spent years making certain we would not find out. He had structured the transfers carefully. He had chosen amounts below reporting thresholds. He had used charm and warmth and the language of family concern as a cover for something that was, at its core, a calculated decision to take from people who trusted him completely. And yet, he miscalculated. He assumed that a 67-year-old schoolteacher in Maryville, Tennessee, would not sit down and read her own financial records closely enough to notice. He assumed that love would do what it often does, which is look away. That assumption was his undoing, and it came from underestimating what a woman who has spent 40 years paying attention to other people's children can recognize when she finally turns that same attention toward her own household. What I know now that I did not fully understand then is that protecting yourself is not betrayal of love. I spent so long believing that investigating Troy meant failing Melissa, that drawing a boundary meant closing a door. It does not. Seeing clearly is not the opposite of loving someone. It is, in its own way, a form of respect for yourself, for the truth, and eventually, even for the people you are forced to hold accountable. Cooper will grow up knowing pieces of this story someday. Not all of it, not yet. But I hope when he is old enough to understand, he takes from it something more useful than bitterness. I hope he learns that the strongest thing you can do for the people you love is to stay honest with them and with yourself. That real strength is not never being deceived. It is being willing to act on what you see, even when acting on it costs you something. The oak tree is still standing in the backyard. We planted daffodils around the base of it, Cooper and I, on a cold Saturday in early spring. He dug the holes with more enthusiasm than precision and got dirt on his jacket and did not care at all. The bulbs will come up in a few months. Gerald says they might not all take. I told him some of them will.